We begin with this story, another diplomat breaking their silence. The ambassador in the growing Ukraine scandal detailing today an unflinching indictment of President Trump and a devastating portrayal of what she described as Donald Trump's very provable diplomatic and national security failings. This being detailed from someone inside the administration, firsthand knowledge. Marie Yovanovitch is the former ambassador to Ukraine, and you saw her there today, walking in to give a deposition to these House impeachment investigators for what turned out to be a very detailed, over 9-hour session, a deposition the Trump administration tried and failed to block. And here, simply put, is how Democratic Congressman Denny Heck described what he heard from her right after walking out of that deposition today.
I just sat through 8 hours that went like a New York second. It was that amazing, that powerful, that impactful, and just feel very fortunate to have been there.
Fortunate to bear witness to that. Now, we don't have all 8 hours of transcripts in the newsroom, but we do have her opening statement, which says she was incredulous the U.S. government, that's the Trump administration, chose to remove an ambassador based, as best she could tell, on, quote, unfounded and false claims by people with clearly questionable motives. That is a reference to the man who, as of 10 minutes ago, the New York Times says is under investigation by the New York feds, Rudy Giuliani, and his allies who were trying to make money profiting off U.S. foreign policy. Back to the ambassador, she says in this written statement, individuals who've been named as contacts of Giuliani may well have believed that their personal financial ambitions were stymied by our anti-corruption policy in Ukraine. Yovanovitch said that she was forced to leave Kiev on the very next plane when she got these orders this spring. And the State Department's number 2 told her, although she had done nothing wrong, this is her account, the president had simply lost confidence in her. Quote, he added that there had been a concerted campaign against me, and the department had been under pressure from the president to remove me since the summer of 2018. Yovanovitch was name-checked by the president on the now infamous phone call with the president of Ukraine, which is the heart of the impeachment matter. The president had said then that it was, quote, bad news, and the people that she was dealing with in Ukraine were also bad news, quote, so I just wanted to let you know that. Now think about this very simply. Trump was expressing that view in what he thought in that moment was a private, secret call that would remain secret, like most of those high-level foreign calls. He couldn't have known that it would soon leak, or that it would tip off the impeachment probe to a new height, or that she would know what he said and strike back today, speaking to this Congress and these investigators considering the impeachment of Donald Trump. But that is what happened. That's what she did today. And she said, quote, our efforts were intended and evidently succeeded in thwarting corrupt interests in Ukraine who fought back by selling baseless conspiracy theories to anyone who would listen. Sadly, someone was listening, and our nation is the worse off for that. I'm just going to pause to tell you, when public servants speak like that in a public forum, they are taking a risk. They're writing off their most recent boss and recommendation and everything else from the Trump administration. But like other whistleblowers and other officials, there is clearly something they're trying to tell us tonight. Now, late this afternoon, we also learned that Ms. Yovanovitch had to be subpoenaed in order to even get that stark assessment out to the public. She's balancing between the orders she gets from the government and then another part of the government, the administration and the Congress. So the House chairs here on the Democratic side said the State Department, at the direction of the Trump White House, directed her not to appear, and thus the House Intelligence Committee issued a subpoena to compel her testimony this morning. Now, next week, these committees have a string of high-profile officials scheduled to give depositions. That includes the Trump Russia advisor, Fiona Hill, NBC reporting she plans to tell Congress Giuliani and EU Ambassador Sondland circumvented the National Security Council and White House process to pursue a, quote, shadow policy on Ukraine. A familiar source tells NBC, and that EU ambassador, Mr. Sondland, the one who spoke to Trump after being told by a diplomat that their whole plot was, quote, crazy, and that withholding security assistance from Ukraine to go after the Bidens was, quote, crazy. Well, he also plans to testify next week in defiance of those initial Trump efforts to silence him. That's a lot coming down the pike. And there's more. Intelligence Committee Chair Adam Schiff writing to colleagues tonight. I'll put it up on the screen so you see exactly what the news is. He says he will be expecting to announce new testimony from the relevant witnesses in the coming days and prepared to compel testimony through duly authorized subpoenas as appropriate. Here he was right after today's deposition.
I also want to express my appreciation for not just what a great champion she was of the rule of law in Ukraine, but also the respect she has for the rule of law here at home. And her willingness, when served with compulsory process, to follow the law and testify. And I think she is a courageous example for others. I think all the members were extraordinarily impressed with her testimony today.
Let's get right to it. On a breaking news Friday night, former U.S. Ambassador to Russia Michael McFaul joins me. He's actually known Ms. Yovanovitch for 30 years. Evelyn Farkas, who was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Obama administration. Evelyn and Ambassador McFaul are both national security analysts here for us. And also joining us tonight, Joshua Geltzer, a former Senior Director for Counterterror at the National Security Council. He's also the Executive Director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection. Ambassador McFaul, what does it mean to hear so starkly from this former ambassador today? And what does it mean to have her point her finger in a measured way, but nonetheless point her finger at Giuliani and his associates when we were learning from the New York Times moments ago that he also is under criminal scrutiny?
Well, first, I just want to underscore what you said earlier, Ari. We've only seen her prepared testimony, right? We have not heard the 9 hours of what she revealed today in that setting. But the prepared text, I just urge all of your viewers to go and read it. It is profound. It is shocking. She is saying very bluntly that I was trying to do my job as a U.S. official. I took an oath of office to the United States of America, and other private people, and Mr. Giuliani, first and foremost, were trying to interfere into the diplomatic work that she was trying to do. It's just very clear, very blunt, very diplomatic, but I was really shocked at what was in that statement.
Evelyn?
Yeah, I mean, I agree 100% with what Mike just said. I found it not shocking so much because we've gotten so much from the whistleblower and from the transcript of the phone conversation. And there were a lot of whispers about the fact that Ambassador Yovanovitch was essentially pushed out because she was standing up against corruption in Ukraine. What we didn't know, those of us who follow Ukraine, is this other backstory of the fact that there were these rogue Americans who were trying to influence Ukrainian policy and working essentially behind her back. Or in front of her, but, you know, not paying any heed to her, so making her ineffective and also breaking the law. So, I mean, she's a courageous person. She's a straight arrow. I also worked with her in the administration, and then afterwards when I was a think tanker and a consultant traveling to Ukraine when she was ambassador. She's a straight arrow. She's very well respected. The good thing about her, I think, is because she's so senior, she really has the strength of the whole Foreign Service behind her. You know, that bureaucracy has a very strong union almost in terms of how they handle personnel issues. So I think that helps in contrast to, for example, Andrew McCabe and the Department of Justice, where he really turned out to have really lost when he came forward and tried to confront his organization.
I want to play for you what we're hearing from the president, who isn't known to have the deepest grasp of every public official or every ambassador in the whole country, but has certainly drilled down on Ukraine as a matter of interest and was criticizing this very person. Take a look.
Why did you recall the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine? Was she a problem? Why did you recall her?
I heard very bad things about her. And I don't know if I recalled her or somebody recalled her, but I heard very, very bad things about her for a long period of time. Not good.
Evelyn?
Well, again, I mean, we know now from the transcript that he was relaying things that he had heard, and from the whistleblower, that he was relaying basically gossip that he had heard from Giuliani. And I think the other thing that Ambassador Yovanovitch makes very clear in her testimony, if you read it, is that you have to understand what's happening in Ukraine. There are all kinds of factions, and I know Mike McFaul knows this very well, Ambassador McFaul. You know, there are all kinds of factions inside Ukraine. They were using Giuliani as much as he was trying to use them, and she understood who the good guys were and who the bad guys were, and the people who were trying to throw dirt on Joe Biden were not good guys.
Josh?
What President Trump calls bad things, most of us would regard as good things. That's what our former ambassador was doing there, as her testimony today, at least the part of it we've been able to read, makes clear. She was trying to do what any U.S. ambassador should do, which is push a country away from corruption. And the irony is, while Trump has claimed that his dealings with the Ukraine have been his efforts to root out corruption, in fact, it was his lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, who was injecting corruption into the system.
And Evelyn, when you look at all this together, do you see this as Donald Trump's impeachment Stonewall strategy losing out? I mean, we're talking about diplomats and other types who are known for their discretion, who might want to speak and at times disagree with the advice not to speak or the request not to, but they honor it. Is something different happening here when we see what is now a phalanx of officials planning to speak out?
Yes, 100%, Ari, because before, the people that they were preventing from going to testify in the Mueller investigation instance were Don McGahn, a guy who really didn't want to come forward and be a whistleblower and didn't want to testify. So he chose to pretend that this White House ban on him testifying was something real and legal, and he hasn't come forward, right? And some of the other folks that they said that they were going to subpoena, and I don't know, some of these things may be even tied up in the courts, they agreed to pretend that the White House could block them. And what the ambassador did today, what Ambassador Yovanovitch did today, was to prove that that's all a bunch of hot air. If you want to testify, even if you are still working for the U.S. government, you can.
So, Ambassador McFaul, when you take this together, the way that the actual Ukraine issue is shifting, at a certain point, if we just simplify it, there's a lot of names, there's a lot of details to it. Is this a scandal that started out looking like an international Watergate, but now also has some elements of Iran-Contra?
Oh, those are hard dots for me to connect. I just want to, but I do think it's really important to keep it simple.
Well,
what was happening here?
Let me follow up and then let you go. The dots being that the Biden stuff is just abuse of power for electioneering and a debate over whether that happened. But if there's a broader national security intrigue, it might be both worse in that it would involve a lot of other people being pressed to do things that are not part of the national security process as it's supposed to work, but also gets very convoluted and complex if people say, well, the fact that Giuliani's buddies wanted something that people in Ukraine also wanted doesn't mean it was automatically contra U.S. interests. Maybe they just agreed. There's a lot of money that splashes around international foreign policy. Unpack for us where these lines are.
So I think at the base, Giuliani was trying to help one of his clients, the President of the United States, to dig up dirt on his electoral opponent, Joe Biden, and his son. And he brought in a couple of other free agents, these two guys that have just been arrested. And the quid pro quo for getting their help was some other financial interests that those two gentlemen, Mr. Fruman and Mr. Parnas, had. And so you have this mixing of both the electoral private interests of the president and possibly, I just want to say we need to know the facts, but possibly the private economic interests of those guys. And all of it is not in the American national interest.
Well, that's one clear way to put it, and much appreciated. Ambassador McFaul, Evelyn, Farkas, and Joshua Geltzer.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.